Some people come into your life silently, no fuss, without exaggerated intensity, no obvious signs. They look normal, maybe even pleasant, educated, pay attention, present in conversations, able to hear you speak during minutes, sometimes hours, but there is a feeling that is difficult to explain, something almost imperceptible, as if, behind that attentive look, something was working in a certain way, different. Have you ever felt this? That strange impression that the person in front of you is there, but not exactly same way as you. She smiles at the right moment, responds intelligently, shows interest, and yet, something doesn't fit. Because while most people enter a conversation looking for connection, some come in looking for information, and this difference is almost invisible. The truth is that there are people who don't connect emotionally the way they do. We imagine. They watch, calculate, interpret. They are not immersed in the emotional experience of the moment. They are analyzing the environment, analyzing you. And here's the detail that almost no one notices. These people don't seem cold at first glance. Quite the contrary. They are often social, charismatic, and even pleasant. They have learned the language of human emotion very well. They know when to smile. They know when to agree. They know when to appear empathetic. But there is one small detail that changes everything. They are not living it. They are reproducing that. Pause for a second. Think about someone you've known in your life, maybe a colleague, a friend, a partner. Someone who seemed to understand people perfectly, someone who always knew exactly what to say. Now think about something else. Did you really feel emotional depth there? Or felt precision? Because there is a huge difference between someone who feels emotions and someone who knows how to interpret them. An emotionally connected person reacts. A cold person watches. And when you start paying attention to it, something unsettling happens. Do you notice that certain social interactions seem less spontaneous than they do? Imagined. Some looks seem more analytical than effective. Some conversations feel like silent investigations. And then an uncomfortable question arises. If some people are there just evaluating, what exactly are they evaluating? Your personality, its usefulness, your vulnerability, its predictability. Now imagine the following situation. You are telling something personal, maybe a fear, maybe frustration, maybe a problem you are experiencing. The person in front of you listens attentively, asks questions, maintains eye contact, shows interest. Everything seems perfectly normal, but there is a possibility that almost no one considers. While you're opening up, she is collecting data about how you think, about how you react, about which situations destabilize you, about which emotions dominate you. And that completely changes the dynamic of the conversation, because while you were seeking understanding, someone could be building a psychological map of you. Now a simple sentence, but it changes the way you see certain social interactions. They're not feeling the environment, they are calculating. And when this realization begins to emerge, something curious happens. You start to revisit memories, old conversations, situations that previously seemed normal, and suddenly certain attitudes take on a new meaning. That specific question, that insistent curiosity, that silent look as you spoke, maybe that wasn't just interest, maybe it was analysis. If you've ever had this feeling, know one thing: you are not alone. Many people who follow this type of conversation have already noticed something similar in some moment in life. Because this space exists for exactly that, to observe human behavior without comfortable illusions. No superficial social masks. Here we try to look at what normally goes unnoticed. And the more closely you observe human behavior, but realize that not everyone enters relationships looking for connection. Some enter seeking position, some enter seeking control, some enter seeking advantage. But there is an even more intriguing detail in this story. These people rarely seem dangerous. In fact, they often seem extremely socially adapted. And that's exactly why almost no one realizes what's really happening. But in the next moment of our conversation, something even more unsettling begins to happen. Appear. Because there is a specific skill that these people develop perfectly, a skill that allows them to spend years living with other people, without almost anyone noticing the difference between real empathy and simulated empathy. And do you understand how this mask works? You never observe certain social interactions the same way again. But before continuing, leave one thing in the comments. Have you ever met someone who seemed to observe people more than they actually noticed? Connect with them? This question can reveal surprising stories, and perhaps more common than we imagine. There is something curious about emotionally cold people. They rarely seem cold. In fact, they often seem like the exact opposite. Sociable, educated, interested, good listeners. They laugh at the right moment. They agree when the conversation calls for agreement. They show surprise when someone tells them something unexpected. At first glance, nothing seems out of place, and that's exactly what makes everything harder to understand. Because most of us have learned to identify emotional coldness in a very specific. We imagine someone far away, dry, indifferent, someone who doesn't react, someone who seems disconnected from the conversation. But the reality can be very different. Some of the most emotionally cold people around are extremely socially skilled. They learn something essential about human behavior. Emotions have patterns, expressions have patterns, reactions have patterns. When someone shares an achievement, we expect enthusiasm. When someone reports a problem, we expect empathy. When someone shares a frustration, we expect understanding. And when you watch enough people, these patterns start to become predictable, very predictable. Now think for a moment. If someone can learn these patterns accurately, what stops that person to simply reproduce them? Not because you feel it, but because you know that it works. This is the point where many people start to get confused. Because true empathy and simulated empathy can seem almost identical, especially in quick interactions, especially at the beginning of a relationship, especially when we want to believe that we are dealing with someone genuine. Have you ever noticed how some people seem extremely good at reading others? They quickly identify the mood of the conversation. They notice subtle changes in mood. They capture emotional details that many people miss. At first glance, this seems like a sign of sensitivity, emotional intelligence. And sometimes it really is. But in other cases, it could just be strategic observation. There is a type of person who develops a very specific skill throughout their life. They become experts in human behavior, not because they seek connection, but because understanding people offers an advantage. In negotiations, in relationships, in social environments, in silent power games that happen all the time between human beings. And when someone develops this ability deeply, something emerges that psychologists, they call it a functional social mask, an adapted identity, a persona perfectly calibrated to the environment. This mask is built over years, observing, testing, adjusting behaviors, learning what builds trust, which generates sympathy, which generates emotional openness in other people. And when this mask works, it becomes almost indistinguishable from a personality genuine. Here an important question arises, a question that may have never crossed your mind before. Are you sure that person really has feelings for you? It seems like a tough question, but it reveals something fundamental about human relationships. Feeling and demonstrating are different things, very different. A person can show affection without feeling affection. You can show concern without feeling worried. You can show interest without feeling interested. Because showing emotion is a behavior, and behaviors can be learned, imitated, perfected. Now stop for a second and think about something curious. Some of the most charismatic people to ever pass through history were also extremely calculating. Some knew exactly how to gain trust, how to generate admiration, how to create emotional closeness. But this closeness was not experienced in the same way by them. It was used. This does not mean that every charismatic person is manipulative, of course, but it does mean that charisma and true empathy are not exactly the same thing. And when someone deeply masters the art of the social mask, a phenomenon arises silent. People around feel connected, but the person behind the mask may just be watching the machine's work. Relationships, almost like a social scientist, analyzing behaviors, testing reactions, measuring limits. And maybe you're realizing something now. Maybe you're remembering someone who seemed really good at understanding people, but which, in some way difficult to explain, never seemed emotionally exposed. He never really seemed vulnerable. He never seemed truly affected by things, always controlled, always stable, always watching. If this memory appears in your mind now, it's worth paying attention to it, because many people who follow these reflections started exactly like that, with small insights, small emotional inconsistencies, little sensations that something wasn't entirely authentic. And when these insights start to emerge, something interesting happens inside who observes. The way of looking at human interactions begins to change. You start to notice pauses, micro-expressions, silences, looks that seem to analyze more than feel. And when that happens, a new layer of social life begins to reveal itself, a layer that has always been there, but most people never learn to see. If you're noticing these things now, you're already looking a little deeper than most. And that's exactly what unites many people who are here now. People who prefer to understand the human mind as it really works, not how we would like her to go. In fact, leave a question in the comments. In your opinion, is it possible for someone to simulate empathy for years without does anyone notice? Many interesting stories emerge when this question comes up, and some of them are more common than we'd like to admit. Because in the next moment of our investigation, something even more unsettling begins to appear. There are very subtle signs, almost invisible signs, small behavioral details that begin to emerge when someone is observing more than connecting. And when you learn to recognize these signs, certain relationships start to make a lot more sense. In almost every human relationship, there is a specific moment when something changes. It's not a big event. It's not a dramatic revelation. It's something much smaller, almost silent, a sensation, a small inconsistency that appears in the middle of a seemingly normal conversation. Maybe you've already experienced this. You are talking to someone. The interaction flows well. The person seems present. She seems interested. But suddenly a small detail appears. Something that doesn't completely match the rest. Maybe it's a delay in emotional reaction. Maybe it's an answer that seems too correct. Maybe it's a look that seems to evaluate rather than share the moment. It's difficult to explain, but anyone who has noticed this knows exactly what we are talking about. It is as if, for a very brief moment, the social mask did not accompany the situation perfectly. A little delay, a little analysis before the reaction. And this happens because there is a fundamental difference between feeling an emotion and interpret an emotion. When someone really feels something, the reaction is usually immediate, spontaneous, inaccurate. Real emotions are not perfectly calibrated. They escape, they exaggerate, they appear before we even think. Now compare this to someone who is observing the situation. Someone who first analyzes the context and only then reacts. The reaction may still seem correct, but there is a small gap, an almost imperceptible moment where the mind is calculating what the answer is, socially appropriate. This break is subtle, but when you start to notice it, it appears in many places. For example, someone tells something very painful. Most people react immediately with emotional discomfort, maybe silence, maybe a worried look, perhaps a spontaneous expression of empathy. But some people do something slightly different. They observe first, as if they were processing the situation, and only then do they respond with the appropriate emotional reaction. Again, this is extremely subtle. Most of the time it goes unnoticed. But there is a reason for that. And this reason begins to appear when psychology studies a specific phenomenon called subclinical psychopathic traits. This expression may seem strong, but the concept is more common than many people imagine. For a long time, when people heard the word psychopathy, They thought immediately on violent criminals, assassins, extreme predators. But more recent research has begun to show something more complex. Psychopathic traits can exist to different degrees. Some people have low levels of these traits, and they continue to live fully functional lives in society. They work. They relate. They create families. They have friends. Externally, they appear completely normal. But internally, some emotional pieces work differently. For example, studies in neuropsychology show that people with these traits can present reduced emotional responses in certain areas of the brain, especially in regions linked to deep emotional empathy. That doesn't mean they don't understand emotions. In fact, many understand perfectly. But understanding and feeling are different processes. There is something called cognitive empathy, and there is something called emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is when you feel the impact of another person's emotion within you. It's almost automatic. It's visceral. You see someone suffering, and you feel something inside you. Now, cognitive empathy works differently. It allows you to rationally understand what the other person is feeling. You recognize the emotional state. You understand the context. You know what the appropriate reaction would be. But this happens more as a mental process than as an experienced shared emotion. And here comes something very important. Some people may have extremely developed cognitive empathy, while they have very low emotional empathy. This creates a very particular psychological profile, because these people can perfectly interpret what others feel. But they don't necessarily share the same emotional intensity. They understand emotion, but they are not invaded by it. Now think about the implications of this in everyday life. If someone can perfectly understand how human emotions work, but it is not dominated by them, this person gains a silent advantage in many social situations, negotiations, discussions, conflicts, relationships. She can observe everything from a greater emotional distance. While other people are emotionally involved in the situation, she may be analyzing the scenario, weighing possibilities, calculating reactions. This does not automatically mean that the person will manipulate others, but it means that she has a different way of positioning herself in human interactions, a more analytical way, more strategic. And when you start to understand this mechanism, some personal experiences begin to take on a new meaning. Maybe that person who seemed extremely good at reading you, maybe that friend who always seemed emotionally stable, even in difficult situations, intense. Maybe that colleague who seemed to understand exactly how to influence conversations. Maybe it wasn't just social sensitivity. Maybe it was observation, analysis, behavioral learning. If this is making sense to you now, it's worth paying attention to something important. Many people who follow discussions like this started exactly like this, with small insights, little moments where something didn't seem entirely spontaneous. Minor emotional inconsistencies. Nothing too big, nothing very obvious, but enough to generate an internal question. Am I noticing something that others aren't seeing? If this question has crossed your mind at some point in your life, you are part of a silent group of people who began to observe human behavior with a little more depth. And when this type of observation begins, it hardly returns to the previous state. You start to notice patterns. You begin to notice predictable reactions. Begin to identify when someone is truly emotionally invested and when someone is just playing a social role. But there is an even more disturbing point in this story, because when someone watches people for a long time, something inevitably happens. That person starts to learn which behaviors build trust, learn which words generate emotional openness, learn what attitudes make people lower their defenses. And when this learning accumulates over the years, something much more sophisticated than simple social observation emerges. A silent process of human evaluation emerges. A process that happens during seemingly normal conversations, during everyday interactions, during relationships that, for one of the parties, seem completely natural. But for the other, they may be functioning as a psychological map under construction. And when this map begins to form, the relationship is no longer just an emotional connection. It turns into something more strategic, something colder, something much more calculated than most people imagine. There is a very specific moment in any human interaction, a moment that almost no one notices. While two people talk, exchange stories, share experiences, one of them may be doing something completely different than it appears. She's not just participating in the conversation. She is building a map, a psychological map, not in the literal sense, but in the most strategic sense possible. As you talk, she notices patterns. How do you react when you are contradicted? How do you react when you receive compliments? What topics excite you? What topics make you insecure? What situations arouse fear? What situations arouse pride? All of this happens in silence. No invasive questions. No obvious interrogations. Just observation. Because when someone learns to observe people deeply, the information begins to emerge naturally. One detail here, a reaction there, a small gesture when a specific theme appears, and little by little, something begins to form in the mind of those who observe. A very accurate understanding of who you are. Now imagine two people having a conversation. One of them is experiencing the interaction emotionally. She is there to share, laugh, vent, bond. The other may be doing something more calculated. She is evaluating, measuring, weighing possibilities. As you spoke, he was measuring your confidence level, measuring how much you expose yourself, measuring how far you would be willing to go for someone. This doesn't happen with mental spreadsheets or conscious note-taking. It's much more subtle than that. It is an almost automatic process that arises when someone observes behavior human repeatedly throughout life. And the more one observes people, the more refined this process becomes. Imagine someone who has spent years paying attention to how people react to social situations. Years of observing emotions. Years analyzing conflicts. Years of realizing what makes someone trust someone else. This kind of observation creates something powerful. Predictability. When you understand people's emotional patterns, many reactions stop being surprise. They become predictable. And when human reactions become predictable, there is a silent advantage in relationships. You can anticipate behaviors, can predict decisions. You can identify emotional weaknesses before the person even realizes it. Now imagine someone using this knowledge in a relationship. Not necessarily aggressively, but in a strategic way. This person learns, for example, which compliments work best for you. Learn which topics make you vulnerable. Learn which insecurities can be activated at specific moments. And this all arises from the same thing. Constant observation. Now an uncomfortable question. How many times have you told someone something personal believing you were creating emotional closeness? And maybe he was. But there is another possibility that almost no one considers. The information you share can become part of your psychological map. A map that reveals how you think, how you react, what moves you, what stops you. And when someone has this map, interacting with you becomes much easier, because your answers start to be predictable. Now think about environments where this type of skill becomes extremely valuable. Competitive environments, power environments, environments where emotional decisions can change everything. Negotiations, companies, complex social relationships. In all of these places, deeply understanding human behavior can offer a huge advantage. That's why there's something curious that studies in social psychology have begun to show. Some people with emotionally cold traits not only function well in these environments, they thrive on them. Because while many people are driven by intense emotions, they can maintain enough emotional distance to analyze the scenario, to calculate movements, to assess risks, and that completely changes the dynamics of a relationship. Because when two people enter an interaction looking for different things, the experience of the relationship can be completely different for each of them. A person seeks connection, the other seeks strategic understanding. A person opens up, the other watches. A person trusts, the other analyzes. This does not mean that all these people are manipulative. Not that all social observation is negative. but it does mean that some relationships may be happening at two different levels at the same time. Same time, an emotional level and an analytical level. And when someone operates mostly at the analytical level, something arises that many people later describe it as a feeling that is difficult to explain. The feeling that they were being watched, not judged, not criticized, but evaluated. If you've ever had this feeling, chances are you haven't been able to explain it. Exactly why? Because there was nothing explicitly wrong. The person was polite, attentive, maybe even affectionate. But there was something in the look, something in the way of listening, something about the way certain questions appeared, as if your every response was being recorded mentally. Many people who begin to study human behavior report exactly this moment. The moment they realize that some social interactions function almost like a silent psychological reading game. And when that realization dawns, something changes forever. You begin to notice pauses before responses. You start to notice when someone changes strategy in a conversation. You begin to feel when a question is not just curiosity, but collection of information, and it can be uncomfortable at first. Because most of us prefer to believe that human relationships are always driven by genuine emotional connection. But the human mind is more complex than that. Much more. There are people who enter a conversation seeking belonging, and there are people who enter a conversation seeking social advantage. There are people who want to share experiences, and there are people who want to understand how you work. And when you notice this difference, something curious happens. Some old memories start to make more sense. Some past relationships gain new interpretations. Some behaviors that previously seemed just weird begin to seem strategic. If you're noticing these layers now, it's worth paying attention to something important. Those who begin to observe human behavior in depth rarely return to see relationships in the same way. Because once you realize the silent evaluation mechanism, you begin to notice something even more intriguing. Some people don't just observe emotions. They learn to reproduce emotions with impressive precision. And when this ability appears, the social mask becomes even more sophisticated. There is a very comfortable idea that most people carry about emotions human. The idea that we all feel more or less the same way, that we all react with similar levels of empathy, that we are all affected in similar ways by the suffering or joy of others. This belief makes the social world simpler, more predictable, safer, but neuroscience has begun to reveal something much more complex. And for some people, a little disturbing. Not all brains process emotions in the same way. Some differences are small, others are profound. Over the past few decades, researchers in psychology and neuroscience have begun to study more precisely the brain functioning of people who present traits of emotional coldness. We're not just talking about extreme criminals. We are talking about individuals who live within ordinary society. They work, interact, they form relationships, but they demonstrate something different when it comes to emotional empathy. One of the regions of the brain that has most attracted the attention of scientists in this field is the cerebral amygdala. The amygdala is a structure deeply involved in processing emotions, especially emotions related to fear, danger, and emotional response to stimuli social. It participates in something fundamental in the human experience, the ability to feel the emotional impact of a situation. When you see someone crying, for example, your amygdala helps generate that automatic emotional response, that feeling of discomfort, of concern, of empathy. But neuroimaging studies began to observe something curious. In some people with psychopathic traits, activity in this region may be significantly reduced when they observe emotional cues from other people. That doesn't mean these people don't understand what's going on. In fact, many understand perfectly. They can identify facial expressions. They can recognize emotions. They know when someone is sad, scared, or angry. But there is a crucial difference. The internal emotional impact may be much less. Now imagine how this changes someone's life experience. While many people feel an intense emotional reaction to certain situations, others may experience the same scenario from a much greater distance. This difference creates something interesting, a kind of emotional freedom in contexts where other people are dominated by their own reactions. Think about an intense argument. Think about a difficult negotiation. Think of an environment where emotions are high. For many people, the heart races. The mind becomes confused. Emotional reaction dominates decision-making. But someone with less emotional reactivity can observe the situation with much more clarity, much more coldly, and this creates a strategic advantage in many social settings. Now, something comes to light that tends to surprise a lot of people. Research in organizational psychology suggests that subclinical psychopathic traits appear with relatively greater frequency in positions of leadership and power. This does not mean that leaders are psychopaths. It's important to make this clear. But some of the traits associated with psychopathy, such as emotional coldness, decision without great emotional weight, and ability to act under pressure, can be advantageous in highly competitive environments, especially in hierarchical structures, especially in corporate environments, especially in contexts where difficult decisions need to be made quickly. This is a point that tends to generate intense discussions when it appears, because it confronts a very romantic view of human nature. The idea that deep empathy always leads to social success. The reality may be more ambiguous. In certain contexts, the ability to maintain emotional distance can facilitate decision strategic. It can make tough negotiations easier. It can facilitate choices that other people would avoid due to emotional discomfort. Now think about the impact of this on personal relationships.
A highly empathetic person can deeply feel the suffering of others. You may hesitate before making decisions that hurt someone. It can carry emotional weight for a long time. But someone with low emotional reactivity may operate differently. You can evaluate situations in a colder way. You can prioritize results over feelings. Can move socially with less internal conflict. And when this psychological profile is combined with a good ability to understand the human behavior,
something very particular begins to emerge. A person who perfectly understands the emotions of others, but it is not dominated by them. This creates a very peculiar position in human relationships, because this person can predict emotional reactions, can anticipate behaviors. You can conduct social interactions with almost strategic precision. Now, an interesting question for you. If someone can understand perfectly how emotions work, but you don't feel these emotions with the same intensity, what does this person really experience in a relationship? Connection or analysis? This question tends to generate very different answers depending on who is reflecting on it. Some people believe that we are all essentially empathetic. Others begin to realize that the human emotional experience can vary much more than we imagine. And here's something curious. When someone has this combination, low emotional reactivity and high understanding human behavior, it can become extremely efficient in navigate social relationships, extremely efficient in influencing environments, extremely efficient in identifying opportunities. But for those on the other side of the relationship, this dynamic can be difficult to understand. Because the social mask continues to work, the sympathy is still present. Conversations continue as normal. Nothing seems explicitly wrong, and yet, there is a strange feeling that some people begin to feel. The feeling that they are being understood, but not necessarily felt. If you've ever had this impression, it's worth paying attention to. Because many people who study human behavior started with exactly that feeling. A small uneasiness that is difficult to explain. A realization that some people seem to understand human emotions, without seeming emotionally affected by them. And when that realization appears, something changes in the way you observe relationships. You start to notice who reacts emotionally and who reacts strategically. You begin to notice who shares experiences and who seems to just record information. You start to notice who gets involved and who always remains a few steps behind, observing. If these reflections are making sense to you now, perhaps you are beginning to noticing something that many people spend years without noticing. The human mind does not always operate with the same type of motivation. Some people seek connection, others seek position. Some get closer out of emotional affinity, others come closer to understand the social game around them. And when you start to realize this, an inevitable question begins to arise within the mind, a question that can be a little uncomfortable, but extremely important. How many times in your life has someone been very close to you, not to connect, but to study you? This is a question that many people who are part of this community begin to ask. Be done at some point. Because when you start to look at human nature without illusions, some silent truths begin to emerge, and some of them can completely change the way you interpret certain past relationships. But the most disturbing part of this story has yet to emerge, because when someone learns to observe people deeply and understands how human emotions work, something inevitable starts to happen. This person learns to reproduce emotions accurately. And when that happens, the difference between real empathy and simulated empathy becomes almost impossible to perceive. There is a moment when this entire discussion stops being just theory. It stops being psychology. It stops being science. And it becomes something personal. Because as you listen to all this, something starts to happen inside your mind. Memories begin to emerge. Faces appear. Old conversations come back. Situations that previously seemed confusing begin to take on new contours. Maybe someone who seemed extremely interested in your life, but curiously, she almost never revealed much about herself. Maybe someone who knew exactly how to calm you down when you were vulnerable, but he never seemed emotionally shaken by anything. Maybe someone who asked very precise questions. Questions that, looking back now, seem to have revealed a lot about you, but they never seemed to truly expose who that person was. Now stop for a second and ask yourself a simple question. Have you ever felt analyzed? Not observed superficially, analyzed, as if someone is trying to understand exactly how you work, as if your every reaction was being recorded mentally, as if certain conversations had a kind of investigative depth, even when it just seemed like normal dialogue. This feeling is much more common than we imagine. But few people can put it into words, because there is no clear event. There is no such thing as scandalous behavior. There is only one pattern, a subtle pattern of constant observation. And when someone realizes this, an uneasiness arises that is difficult to ignore. Because if someone is watching you like that, what exactly is this person trying to find out? Your emotional limits, your insecurities, your motivations, your weaknesses? Now an even more uncomfortable question, and if you're not a friend, but just one variable, a variable within a silent evaluation system. This sentence may seem harsh, but it reveals something profound about certain human dynamics. Some people enter relationships seeking belonging. They want to share experiences. They want to feel understood. They want to create real emotional bonds. But others enter relationships with a different objective. They want to understand how people work. They want to identify patterns. They want to know who reacts in what way, who is predictable, who is influenceable, who is trustworthy, who can be useful. And when someone operates in this mental mode, relationships begin to have a strategic. This does not mean that the person necessarily wants to harm others, but it does mean she views human interactions through a different lens, an analytical lens, an assessment lens. Now think about something curious. Most people experience human relationships emotionally. Interactions are affinity-driven, for empathy, by identification. But anyone who observes human behavior from an emotional distance can notice something that many don't see. Relationships also involve exchange of value, influence, social position, access to resources, access to information. This level of social reading is not often discussed openly, but it exists, and some people become extremely good at noticing it. They quickly identify who has power in a given environment, who has influence, who has valuable knowledge, who has access to important social networks. And when these people interact, they don't just observe emotions, observe structures, observe opportunities. They observe social movements happening around them. Now imagine someone who can do this silently for years, talking, laughing, sharing moments, but at the same time, deeply observing how each person around works. This type of psychological profile can go completely unnoticed for a long time. Because outwardly everything seems ordinary. The person does not need to act hostile. You don't need to manipulate it explicitly. She just watches, learns, records patterns. And then something interesting comes up. Over time, this person can predict behavior with surprising accuracy. She knows who will react emotionally, who will crack under pressure, who will defend a position, who will avoid conflict. She knows who can be persuaded, who can be ignored, who needs to be pleased. Now think about how this changes the balance of a relationship. When one person deeply knows the other's emotional patterns, it has a silent advantage, because you can anticipate reactions before they even happen, can adjust own behavior to generate specific responses, and this creates something very particular in human relationships, an invisible asymmetry. A person is experiencing the relationship emotionally. The other may be navigating the relationship strategically. If you're reflecting on all of this right now, maybe you're realizing something important. Most people never stop to think about this level of social dynamics. They live relationships spontaneously, which is not wrong. In fact, it is the natural form of most human interactions. But whoever begins to observe these psychological mechanisms begins to notice something that before it was invisible. Some relationships have layers, emotional layers, social layers, strategic layers, and some people navigate these layers with impressive skill. If these ideas are awakening reflections in you now, perhaps it's because you've already noticed something similar at some point in his life. Maybe in a friendship, maybe in a relationship, maybe in a work environment. Many people who follow this type of psychological investigation report exactly that. A moment when they begin to notice that certain people seem to read the environment social like a board. And when this realization appears, a new question inevitably arises. If some people observe and analyze human behavior in this way, how exactly do they use this information in relationships? This is the part where the story starts to get even more intriguing, because when someone deeply understands how emotions work and learn to observe human vulnerabilities, she may also learn something even more powerful, how to influence behavior in an almost invisible way. And this is exactly where we begin to enter the territory of so-called predators social. When most people hear the word predator, their mind immediately imagines something obvious, something aggressive, something violent, something visible. But in human behavior, the most efficient predators rarely appear threatening. In fact, they often seem exactly the opposite. Educated, interesting, reliable, because social predators don't survive by force. They survive by reading. Reading people, reading emotions, vulnerability reading. While most people enter a conversation trying to express themselves, they come in trying to understand. And the more they understand, the easier it becomes to navigate human relationships. There is a behavioral pattern that psychologists frequently observe in individuals with a high level of emotional coldness, combined with good social intelligence. They become extremely accurate readers of behavior. They perceive micro-expressions. They notice changes in the tone of voice. They notice hesitations before responding. Little signs that many people completely ignore. These details reveal something very valuable. Emotional states, insecurities, limits, psychological pressure points. Now imagine someone who can identify all of this in just a few minutes of interaction. Imagine someone who quickly realizes what motivates you, what worries you, what do you avoid, what you need emotionally. This ability creates something powerful. Influence. Not an explicit influence, but a silent influence. Because when someone deeply understands how you react emotionally, that a person can adjust their behavior to generate specific responses in you. A compliment at the right time. A subtle criticism at the right time. A show of closeness when you are vulnerable. An emotional withdrawal when you start to pull away. All of this may seem spontaneous, but for someone who strategically observes human behavior, it can be just behavior adjustment. Now there is something even more intriguing about this process. Empathy can be simulated. This phrase tends to cause discomfort when it appears, because most of us associate empathy with something genuine, something that comes naturally. But from a behavioral point of view, empathy also has learned components: facial expressions, tone of voice, eye contact, body posture, emotional validation phrases. All of these elements can be observed, learned, reproduced, and when someone learns to reproduce these signals accurately, a skill emerges extremely powerful in human relationships, the ability to appear deeply understanding, even without necessarily sharing the same emotional experience. Now think about the implications of this. A person may show complete attention while you speak, can maintain eye contact, may ask questions that seem to reveal empathy. It can validate your emotions, and all of this can be perceived by you as connection. But for those who perform these behaviors, it may just be a social technique. This does not mean that all people who show empathy are malingering. Quite the contrary. Most people really feel what they show. But individuals with a high level of cognitive empathy can reproduce this behavior extremely convincingly. And when this skill is combined with constant observation of behavior, something emerges that social psychologists describe as relational influence strategic, a way to navigate relationships using psychological knowledge of the people involved. Now imagine someone who has three characteristics at the same time: low emotional reactivity, high social reading ability, good ability to imitate empathetic behaviors. This set creates a very particular profile in human interactions, a person who can enter social environments, quickly observe emotional dynamics, identify vulnerabilities, and adjust your own behavior to generate specific responses. In some cases, this may just be used for social adaptation, to navigate complex environments, to negotiate, to lead. But in other cases, it can be used for something more delicate: control, subtle control, control that doesn't feel like control, control that happens through emotional influence. Now think about how this might appear in everyday life. A person who knows exactly when to offer support, exactly when to withdraw attention, exactly when it provokes insecurity, exactly when to demonstrate closeness. These behavioral changes can generate very strong emotional reactions in those who is on the other side, because human emotions respond intensely to signals of acceptance and rejection, and when someone controls these signals precisely, they can direct the dynamics of relationship. Many people who have been through emotionally confusing relationships report something similar after they begin to reflect on the experience. They say there seemed to be a kind of invisible control. There was no screaming. There were no threats. But there was a constant feeling of reacting to the other person's emotional changes. Person. Now, an important question. If someone deeply understands how human emotions work and learn to reproduce empathy convincingly, how to distinguish true connection from social strategy? This is not a simple question. In fact, it's a question that many people spend years trying to answer after certain life experiences, because the line between genuine behavior and strategic behavior can be blurred, extremely subtle, especially when the social mask is well constructed. But there is a detail that tends to appear when we observe relationships over time. Time. Genuine emotional connections leave emotional marks. They involve real vulnerability, real exchange, real emotional impact. But when a relationship is driven primarily by analysis and strategy, something is usually missing. Shared emotional depth. The relationship may seem intense. It may seem engaging, but on some level, it can feel unbalanced, as if a person is emotionally invested, while the other always remains a few steps behind, observing, calculating, adjusting movements. If you're thinking deeply about this right now, maybe you're realizing something that many people only realize very late. Not every socially skilled person is seeking emotional connection. Some are simply navigating the social environment with psychological precision. And when you understand this mechanism, one last reflection begins to emerge. Perhaps the most disturbing question of all. If some people spend their lives observing and evaluating others in this way, how many of them are around us without us noticing? It is this question that leads us to the final point of our investigation. Because when you start to see these dynamics, the social world never looks quite the same again. There is something deeply uncomfortable about realizing all of this. Because deep down, we all grew up believing in one very simple idea about human relations. The idea that when two people talk, they are both experiencing the same emotional experience. That when someone shows empathy, that empathy is real. That when someone shows interest, that interest comes from the same emotional place than ours. This belief underpins much of the social trust we build throughout our lives. It makes the world more predictable, more human, safer. But when you start to observe human behavior more closely, a more complex reality begins to appear. Not all people enter relationships looking for connection. Some enter seeking understanding. Others enter seeking positioning. Others enter seeking advantage. And the most intriguing thing is that often these differences are invisible. Externally, everything looks normal. Conversations happen, relationships form, moments are shared. But internally, the motivations can be very different. A person approaches because they feel affinity. The other approaches because she sees potential. A person opens up emotionally. The other records information. A person seeks belonging. The other observes the functioning of the relationship. This doesn't mean the world is full of manipulators or predators, but it means, and human nature is more varied than we like to imagine. Some people live relationships with emotional depth. Others live relationships with analytical distance. And when these two ways of functioning meet, something curious can happen. A person believes they are building a connection. The other may simply be assessing the scenario. Now stop for a moment and think about something important. Observing these dynamics should not generate paranoia. It should not turn relationships into constant suspicion. That's not the goal. The goal is awareness. Awareness about how human behavior really works. Awareness of the different ways people relate to each other. Because when you understand this, something changes inside you. You start to notice signs, start identifying patterns. You begin to feel when someone is emotionally present, and when someone is just performing a social role. And interestingly, the more you observe, the more you notice something interesting. Emotionally connected people leave traces. They demonstrate vulnerability. They demonstrate emotional inconsistency. They demonstrate moments of doubt. They demonstrate moments of real openness. They expose themselves. But those who operate only in the field of strategic observation rarely expose themselves true. It is rarely seen completely. There is always a layer of control. There is always an emotional distance. There is always the feeling that that person is a little out of the picture, even when you are participating in it. And when you learn to notice this difference, something silent happens. You start to choose your connections better, start observing more carefully, start valuing people who demonstrate real humanity, imperfections, genuine emotions, spontaneous reactions, because these are the signs that indicate something very important, true emotional presence. If this conversation provoked reflections in you, that already reveals something about the type of person who you are. Because anyone who starts to question these dynamics is usually not interested in superficial social games. He is interested in understanding the human mind in a deeper way. And that's exactly what unites the people who are here now. People who prefer to look beyond social masks. People who prefer to understand the psychological mechanisms behind behavior human. People who are not satisfied with simple explanations for a human nature that is extremely complex. In fact, leave a reflection in the comments. In your life experience, do you believe you have ever met someone who seemed more interested in understanding you than actually connecting with you? This is a question that tends to generate very revealing stories that often show how these dynamics are more common than we imagine. And if you've made it this far in this investigation, maybe there's a reason. Maybe you are also someone who notices certain details in human behavior that go unnoticed by most. People like this tend to form a silent community, a community of observers, people who prefer to understand before judging, who prefer to analyze before reacting. And if you believe that more people should develop this kind of awareness about human behavior, share this reflection with someone who also likes to understand the human mind more deeply. Because conversations like this rarely appear in the most superficial places of internet. And the more people learn to observe human behavior clearly, it becomes more difficult for social masks to go unnoticed. Ultimately, there is a simple truth about all of this. Cold people rarely seem cold. They look normal, social, adapted. But there is one detail that changes everything. While many people enter relationships looking for connection, they enter seeking understanding. While many enter trying to feel, they come in trying to understand. And the most disturbing thing about this is something that few people realize in time. These people can spend years by our side, talking, laughing, sharing moments, without us noticing the fundamental difference in the way they experience these relationships. And perhaps the most important reflection of all is this: not every smile indicates connection, not all empathy indicates feeling, and not all proximity means that two people are living the same experience emotional. Because sometimes, as long as you believe you are connecting with someone might just be studying you. Before I finish, let me tell you something very directly. Most people spend their entire lives believing they understand how relationships humans work. He believes he knows how to identify who is true, who is trustworthy, who really cares. But the truth is that the human mind is very more complex than we were taught. There are people who feel deeply, and there are people who just observe deeply. And these two ways of existing in the world can seem identical for a long time. Maybe you've never stopped to think about it before. Or maybe, while listening to all this, some faces passed by your head, some old conversations, some relationships that, looking back today, seem to have had something strange in the air. And if this happened to you now, don't worry. You're not being paranoid. You are becoming aware that not everyone enters your life for the same reason you enter in their lives. Some people want connection. Others want understanding. Some want to share their lives. Others just want to understand how you work. And when you start to notice that difference, something powerful happens. You start to value more those who really show themselves to be human, who exposes themselves, who makes mistakes, who shows real emotion. Because real people aren't perfect. Real people aren't calculated all the time. Real people feel, and feeling leaves marks. Now I want to ask you a sincere question. Have you ever had the feeling that someone was studying you more than connecting with you? That strange feeling that the person seemed to understand everything about you, but you could never really understand her. If this has already happened, write here in the comments, I already realized that. I really want to read these stories. Because one thing this channel proves every day is that a lot of people start to realize these things. But you think you're alone, and it isn't. There are a lot of people here who also observe human behavior in a more deep. People who pay attention to details, in the silences, in the looks, in small inconsistencies. And it is exactly this community that we are building here. A community of people who truly want to understand the human mind. No illusions, no masks. So if this type of conversation makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel, because here we will continue exploring what most people prefer. Pretend it doesn't exist. The silent part of the human mind. The part that observes. The part that manipulates. The part that hides. And also, the part that learns to see all of this. Because once you learn to see, you never stop noticing it. And that can be uncomfortable at first, but it can also be liberating. Because when you understand how people really work, you start to better choose who deserves to be close to you, and who was just sizing you up.